Theodore Roosevelt stepped off a train at Williams, Arizona on May 6, 1903. A stagecoach carried him 40 miles north through ponderosa pine forest. When the trees stopped, the ground dropped away, and the Grand Canyon opened in front of him without warning. He stood at the south rim for several minutes and said nothing. Then he turned to the crowd behind him. One instruction: leave it as it is. The ages had done the work, he said. Man could only mar it. The crowd applauded, and the newspapers printed the speech the following morning. What happened in the 5 years after that speech is not in the brochures. Roosevelt had already tried 3 times to get Congress to protect the canyon and failed, going back to a first proposal in 1882, when he was still in the New York State Assembly. A territorial businessman named Ralph Cameron held the most consequential objection. He had staked copper mining claims into the canyon walls since the 1890s, built a private trail to the canyon floor, and charged visitors $1 to walk it. Both the trail and the mining rights were profitable, and Cameron had no intention of surrendering either to federal management. He held influence with the territorial delegation and later became a U.S. Senator. The senators who voted against protection knew exactly what the bills would cost him. They voted accordingly, 3 times, the last time in 1906, the same year Congress passed a law Roosevelt had been quietly anticipating. The Antiquities Act had passed that June. Its stated purpose was protecting Native American archaeological sites from commercial looting, and it gave the president authority to declare national monuments by executive proclamation, no Senate vote required. The text included a phrase that would matter: scientific interest. Roosevelt's legal team spent months of 1907 building the case that the canyon's geology qualified under that language. The argument held. On January 11, 1908, Roosevelt signed the Grand Canyon Proclamation. 808,120 acres became a national monument. Cameron filed 2 legal challenges and lost both. He spent the next 15 years pursuing his mining claims in court and never recovered them. Most histories treat 1908 as the end of that story. Roosevelt saw a beautiful canyon, fought for it, and won. Scientists who spent decades inside the canyon arrived at a longer version. Clinton Hart Merriam had reached the canyon country 19 years before the monument. The U.S. Biological Survey sent him to northern Arizona in 1889 to catalog wildlife, and he spent weeks climbing between the Flagstaff Basin and the high country of the San Francisco Peaks, logging species and temperature at each elevation. What the numbers showed reorganized his thinking about North American biology. Species changed in bands as altitude increased, desert animals giving way to forest species and, near the summit, to animals more typical of Canada than Arizona. The shifts happened at consistent elevation thresholds. Merriam compared his altitude data with latitude data from surveys further north and found the correlation nearly exact. A gain of 1,000 feet in elevation produced the same biological shift as traveling 300 miles north. He called the bands life zones, 6 of them stacked from the canyon floor near 2,500 feet to the north rim above 8,000 feet. Between those 2 points, plant communities shift from desert scrub to boreal forest, a biological range equivalent to a journey from northern Mexico to the edge of Canada, compressed into 1 vertical mile. Merriam published the framework in 1898, and field biologists used it to explain species distributions for the next 60 years. No comparable area in the region compressed that range of biological conditions into walkable distance. The canyon had produced a major scientific idea before it had any legal protection at all. The canyon had been generating findings since 1869, when a one-armed Civil War veteran named John Wesley Powell led 10 men and 4 wooden boats through its interior for the first time. His expedition geologist, John Strong Newberry, understood what he was seeing in the canyon walls. Each horizontal band was a separate chapter of Earth's history, older with depth. His expedition geologist, John Strong Newberry, had studied canyon geology on an earlier overland survey in 1857 and understood immediately what the river expedition was passing through. Later surveys with better dating tools filled in the sequence. The Kaibab limestone at the rim dates to roughly 270 million years. The Redwall limestone, visible in nearly every photograph of the middle walls, dates to about 340 million years. At the very bottom, exposed at river level, sits the Vishnu schist, dating to approximately 1.7 billion years, among the oldest rock exposed anywhere in North America. Pressing a hand against the canyon wall at river level means touching material formed before complex animal life existed on Earth. The Grand Canyon is one boundary line. It is not the only one. Yellowstone National Park sits on top of one of the largest volcanic systems in North America. In 1966, a microbiologist named Thomas Brock pulled a water sample from a Yellowstone hot spring running near 70 degrees Celsius, a temperature nothing was supposed to survive at, and found a bacterium living there anyway. He named it Thermus aquaticus. 18 years later, a chemist working on a new method for copying DNA needed an enzyme that could survive repeated heating without breaking down, and Thermus aquaticus had already solved that problem inside a park boundary drawn in 1872. The enzyme from Brock's discovery became the engine behind the polymerase chain reaction, the same process behind most modern DNA diagnostics, traced back to a hot spring protected because Congress decided the geysers were worth keeping. That story does not appear in most park brochures either. Neither does the Everglades tree island holding one of the oldest unlogged stands of bald cypress on the continent, nor the population of Channel Islands foxes that shrank to the size of house cats over thousands of generations with no predator large enough to select against small body size. A textbook case of insular dwarfism sitting inside a boundary drawn in 1980. Every national park and monument in the country is running the same experiment the Grand Canyon has been running since 1908. Something gets protected for one stated reason. Decades later, researchers find out what else the boundary was holding. I put 60 of these together into a written guide called The Boundary Line. It works through parks and monuments across the country the same way this video worked through the canyon, tracing each discovery back to the year the boundary was drawn and the scientist who eventually found what it was protecting. Some of the discoveries are large. The PCR story changed medicine. Some are smaller and stranger, like a moth in Great Smoky Mountains National Park not formally described until 2019. Still living in the same 3 counties biologists first logged in the 1930s. Each chapter runs the same way: the proclamation date, the boundary that got drawn, the scientist who showed up decades later, and what they found that needed the boundary intact to survive long enough to be found at all. Death Valley holds a version of the same story in miniature. Devil's Hole pupfish live in a single limestone cavern pool, roughly the size of a 2-car garage, cut off from every other body of water for somewhere between 10 and 20,000 years. And adapted to survive water conditions that would kill almost any other fish species within hours. The pool sits inside a detached unit of Death Valley National Park, drawn around a single spring specifically because Franklin Roosevelt's 1952 proclamation named the fish by species. The guide draws from the same kind of sourcing this video did: peer-reviewed papers, agency survey records, and original field notes in public archives, not Park Service marketing copy. Where a claim could not be traced to a primary source, it did not make the cut. 60 sites made the cut anyway, chosen from a longer list of roughly 200 candidates. Each chapter runs roughly 800 words and closes with the sources it drew from, organized by region so a specific park is easy to find without reading the whole thing front to back. There is a section near the end most readers do not expect. It tracks the boundaries that did not hold, several monuments where protections were later reduced, and what that reduction removed from the scientific record. One chapter lays out what researchers had cataloged inside a monument's original boundary before it was cut by more than half, including an active research site that lost its protection mid-study. It is not written as an argument. It is a record of what was measured before the boundary changed and what was no longer covered after, sourced to the original survey data on each side. Readers can draw their own conclusions from the numbers. The guide is free. It sits behind no paywall, and there is no trial that quietly converts into a subscription. The link is in the description below this video. Enter an email address, and it arrives as a formatted PDF, built to read on a phone, a tablet, or a laptop, a little over 100 pages with the maps and source lists included. A narrated audio version is available through the same link at no extra cost, read chapter by the same voice narrating this video. Putting together 60 research chapters took real time, and giving them away for nothing runs on the same logic as a lot of independent documentary work now. Advertising revenue from a video like this one covers a fraction of the research time behind it, and this particular video took several weeks of reading through Park Service archives and academic papers before a single word of the script got written. The guide grew out of the same research pile, expanded to cover the sites that did not fit into any single video. Readers who find it useful tend to come back for the next video, and some support the channel directly through the options in the description. None of that is required to get the guide. A number of teachers have also started using individual chapters in classrooms, which is fine. Non-commercial classroom use needs no permission. The boundary line gets updated roughly twice a year as new studies come out of these sites. A reader who downloaded it 6 months ago is already sitting on an outdated copy since 2 chapters have been added, including one on a beetle species logged inside a stand of protected old growth in early 2026, after going undocumented for more than 100 years. Anyone who already has the guide can pull the current version through the same link, no second sign-up required. This channel plans to keep working through individual sites the same way this video worked through the canyon, one boundary and one buried discovery at a time. Yellowstone is next, followed by the Everglades, and the guide will stay ahead of the video schedule for anyone who wants the fuller written version of a site before its video goes up. The canyon chapter in the guide runs longer than most of the others, close to 2,000 words, with several details that did not make it into this video for time, among them the full account of Merriam's 1889 survey route and a longer breakdown of Greer-Dolby's 2020 genomic study, with the complete list of the 34 species groups that showed measurable separation between the rims. If any of the discoveries earlier in this video landed, the Kaibab squirrel accumulating 6 million years of separation on one rim, the humpback chub building a hydraulic structure the Colorado River required of it, the condors finding the same thermal columns their ancestors used before 1950, that same pattern is sitting inside dozens of other boundaries most people have never heard the full story on. The link is in the description below. Now, back to 1908. And to what the geological argument alone could not account for. When Roosevelt's legal team assembled the 1908 monument case, the geological record was the primary argument. The biological argument took most of the 20th century to assemble. While cataloging life zones, Merriam was also collecting animals, and on the North Rim's ponderosa forest he collected squirrels unlike any he had seen elsewhere in the territory. North Rim squirrels had pure white tails and dark underparts. Every squirrel on the South Rim had a gray belly. He concluded he was looking at a distinct species, described it formally in 1904 as Sciurus kaibabensis, and filed the paper. The Kaibab squirrel sat in the literature as a regional curiosity for 4 decades. In the late 1940s, a biologist named Ernst Mayr published a major work on how species form, drawn from years studying bird populations isolated on Pacific islands and in Highland New Guinea. He called the process allopatric speciation. A physical barrier divides one population into 2, and each half accumulates genetic differences independently, until, given enough time, the 2 become reproductively incompatible. When Mayr's framework reached American biology departments, the Grand Canyon appeared immediately in the discussion. No tree squirrel had ever crossed the inner canyon. The cliff walls and the vertical mile between the rims worked as effectively as open water, The canyon had been dividing the squirrel population since the Colorado first cut through, roughly 6 million years ago. The North Rim population bred with other North Rim squirrels, the South Rim with South Rim squirrels, and traits drifted independently on each side. The white tail and dark underside of the Kaibab squirrel are the accumulated record of that drift. It became a standard teaching example in evolutionary biology, appearing in major textbooks and museum exhibits for decades. What Miriam collected as a regional curiosity became evidence for a foundational principle of biology. The Colorado River at the canyon floor runs through a hydraulic corridor narrowed by canyon walls, with spring snowmelt moving through in concentrated pulses. A biologist named Robert Rush Miller formally described a fish found nowhere outside the canyon in 1946, Gila saifa, the humpback chub, named for the muscular ridge behind its head that let it hold position against the current without constant swimming. No relative living in calmer water had developed the structure, but by the time Miller published, the conditions that built the fish were already changing. Hoover Dam, completed upstream in 1935, had shifted the Colorado from warm and sediment-heavy to cold and clear, and Miller noted the fish's vulnerability in his own paper. Glen Canyon Dam came online upstream in 1966 and hit the chub harder still, rendering its main spawning grounds nearly unusable. Populations retreated to the Little Colorado River, a tributary that sat entirely within the 1908 and 1919 monument and park boundaries, undammed and undeveloped. The fish survived because one protected tributary remained intact. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed it as endangered in 1967, among the first fish to receive that designation. Recovery efforts, including experimental water releases from Glen Canyon Dam meant to mimic the seasonal floods the fish had evolved for, began in earnest in the 1990s. A species unknown to science until 1946 had become a landmark case in conservation law, kept alive long enough to be found by boundaries drawn decades earlier. The California condor once ranged over most of the continent, feeding on the carcasses of large Pleistocene animals until that food supply collapsed roughly 10,000 years ago and the population pulled back to coastal California. By 1970, fewer than 60 wild birds remained. With a wingspan of 9.5 feet, condors locate food by sight from altitude, riding thermal columns that the canyon's sun-heated cliffs generate reliably, with open airspace and minimal human activity. By 1987, only 22 condors existed on Earth, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service captured every remaining wild bird. Breeding programs began in San Diego and Los Angeles. 9 years passed with nothing in the sky. In 1996, wildlife managers released 6 condors into the canyon, where national park boundaries had kept the cliff habitat undisturbed for 77 years. The birds found the thermal columns within days. A nest inside the canyon produced a wild-hatched chick in 2003, Arizona's first in over a century. By 2007, the canyon population had passed 70 birds, and recovery teams counted more than 300 wild condors across the Southwest by 2024, with the canyon as the geographic core of that recovery. The cliff habitat was there to use in 1996 because no one had been permitted to alter it since 1908. A 2020 genomic study from Northern Arizona University, led by biologist Greer Dolby, tested whether the canyon's isolation effect extended beyond the Kaibab squirrel. Her team sampled lizards, millipedes, scorpions, beetles, and 6 bird species on both rims, and found the same pattern in every group. North Rim populations carried different DNA from South Rim populations. Dolby called the canyon a speciation factory in the study's published discussion, and the term was exact. The mechanism was the same in every group. The Colorado River as a barrier, the altitude gap between the rims as a climate separator, 6 million years as the operating window. At least 34 species groups showed significant genetic separation between the rims. Some diverged far enough that biologists were debating whether they had already become distinct species. Merriam found one thread in 1889. Dolby's team found the canyon had been running the same separation on dozens of species at once. In 1975, a hydrogeologist named Paul Knopf began studying the water chemistry of the canyon springs and found they were drawing from an aquifer whose recharge zone was the plateau surface above, more fragile than any previous assessment had recognized. The park boundary protected what was inside it, but the aquifer extended beyond those boundaries. In 2012, the Obama administration withdrew over 1 million acres around the canyon from new mining claims for 20 years, invoking the same Antiquities Act Roosevelt had signed. A mine near Tusayan resumed uranium extraction in 2017 under claims exempted from that withdrawal, and whether elevated uranium near the site reaches the canyon springs remains disputed. The Havasupai people have lived in the canyon for over 800 years, drawing their name from the blue-green water of Havasu Creek, its turquoise color the product of dissolved calcium carbonate, a color the creek has carried since before any written record of the canyon exists. When Roosevelt signed the 1908 proclamation, the Havasupai were already living inside what became monument land, and the boundaries were drawn without consulting the tribe. In 1919, when Congress established the national park, the Havasupai were confined to a 518-acre reservation on the canyon floor, a fraction of the land their families had relied on for generations. Decades of legal challenges followed, and in 1975 Congress restored 185,000 acres of plateau land to the tribe. A 2018 monitoring study found that in multiple documented cases, tribal members had recorded changes in spring flow, plant timing, and animal behavior before formal scientific surveys caught the same changes. 800 years of continuous presence had built an observational baseline no 20th century program could replicate. None of what came after was visible in 1920, when the last active mining claim inside the monument had finally been settled. Miller would not describe the humpback chub for another 26 years. Meyer's framework would not reach American biology until the late 1940s. The condor release was 68 years away. Dolby's genomic study 92. The 1908 protection did not guarantee any of it. It held the conditions under which it became possible: an intact North Rim forest, a river corridor without mining infrastructure, spring systems undisturbed by plateau drilling, cliff faces where condors could land undisturbed. Every study that required a living population or an intact tributary was drawing on that boundary. Roosevelt stood at the South Rim in May 1903 and told the crowd to leave it alone, responding to what he could see: a mile of vertical depth, 18 miles across at the widest point, 277 river miles from the eastern entrance to the western boundary. He had no instruments to detect what was happening inside the canyon that day. The squirrel on the North Rim was accumulating differences from its South Rim relatives one generation at a time. The fish at the canyon floor had spent millions of years building its hump for a current specific to that corridor. The aquifer below his feet was filtering rainwater toward springs that would later become the subject of federal legal battles. None of that was measurable in 1908. Scientists spent the following 100 years finding each piece, inside boundaries that held because Roosevelt signed a proclamation and Cameron eventually ran out of legal arguments. A 2023 survey of the canyon's microbial communities found strains in the spring systems with no close relative in any existing database. The geological record will not change. It has been there for 1.7 billion years. The biological record is less durable. It depends on habitat that can be removed. The boundary Roosevelt signed in 1908 has held it so far. What was not understood then was found because it was protected. What remains to be found is protected by the same boundary.